Perhaps one of the most notable automotive failures of all time, the Edsel mark by Ford, is a staple of how the success of a car is dictated by more factors than just how many people have heard about it. As while Ford attempted to rationalize the disastrous sales record of this short-lived range of cars through marketing and promotion, the bitter truth was that the Edsel was a loss-making mountain of problems that culminated in one of the most ill-conceived cars ever built. The tale of the Edsel begins in the mid-1950s, where in the post-war economic boom, car production in the United States was soaring, with the Detroit Big Three sitting atop the American market as Ford and General Motors dominated the scene, while Chrysler followed closely behind. On January 17, 1956, the Ford Motor Company became a publicly traded corporation, taking it partially out of the hands of the Ford family, under which it had been originally founded by Henry Ford in 1903. This change of management leading the company executives to notice that their exclusive luxury mark, Lincoln, was struggling to compete with the General Motors equivalent of Cadillac. As Cadillac became the face of American motoring glamour, Lincolns were falling down the price bracket, instead largely competing against middling Oldsmobiles and Buicks, with Ford's brand structure at the time consisting of three marks, the luxury Lincoln at the top, Mercury for entry-level premium cars, and the Ford name itself for low-end family models. By comparison, General Motors had the luxury Cadillac, Buick for executive motors, Oldsmobile for entry-level premium models, and Chevrolet for low-end family cars. And so to counter this, Ford executives chose to create a new medium-priced car division equivalent to Oldsmobile, while pushing Lincoln and Mercury upmarket to make them comparable to Cadillac and Buick. In addition, Lincoln's top-of-the-range model, the Continental, would become its own ultra-luxury mark designed to rival the likes of the Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud, with market research into the development of a mark that would sit in the same bracket as Oldsmobile beginning during 1955, and was dubbed the experimental car or E-car. The target demographic for the E-car was identified as young professionals on their way up, and considered that these people would have the money to buy cars of a higher luxury level than humdrum Fords, but not enough to buy top-end Lincolns, with people of this category being asked what they expected to find in a car that would befit their pay bracket and social standing, and the feedback was used to guide the design. For young professionals, they were looking for a car that would stand out at any angle, a machine that would turn heads and announce their arrival with a pronounced hood and grille, reminiscent of pre-war Packards and LaSalle's, while at the same time, the car needed to be contemporary with the space-age styling trend of the mid-50s, with an aviation-style interior and controls, chrome, fins, and powerful engines. There were, however, initial stumbling points for the E-car mark, most notably the name, and in order to counter this problem, Ford turned to advertising firm Foote, Cone & Belding to come up with a moniker for the new brand, eventually considering 6,000 possibilities, much to the chagrin of Ford Executive Vice President Ernest Breech, who only wanted one. Among the 6,000 names conjured, early favourites for the brand included Citation, Corsair, Pacer and Ranger, but these ultimately ended up as the model names rather than the mark itself, while David Wallace, manager of marketing research, and co-worker Bob Young unofficially invited freethinker poet Marianne Moore for input and suggestions. However, Moore's modernist and somewhat unorthodox considerations gave rise to such oddities as the utopian turtletop, the pastelogram, the Turcatinga, the Resilient Bullet, the Andante con Moto, and the Mongoose Civique, though none of these obscure titles were ultimately chosen. Eventually, out of sheer desperation, the marketing team settled on an idea that had been circulating since early in the mark's development, that being the Edsel, a homage to Edsel B. Ford, the son of Henry Ford and president of the company between 1919 and 1943, as well as being the father of the company's then president Henry Ford II. Going somewhat behind Ford's back, Ernest Breech officially declared that the new mark would be dubbed the name Edsel at a board meeting that Henry Ford was conveniently absent from, the use of the Edsel moniker invoking the ire of the Ford family, with Henry Ford himself stating that he did not want his father's good name spinning around on thousands of hubcaps. To further cement the problems with the choice of the Edsel as a title, Ford ran surveys outside movie theaters to gather audience reactions to the name, to which they received no conclusion, as aside from Henry Ford's complaints about the title, there were other vocal critics of the Edsel mark within the company management, most notably Robert McNamara. McNamara had been hired by Ford immediately after the end of World War II, as the company was teetering on bankruptcy, and thus required a significant change in its internal policy and management structure. McNamara being one of 10 ex-US Air Force veterans, dubbed the Whiz Kids, who helped to reverse the fortunes of the firm, and his cost-cutting and cost-containment skills stood out among the rest. In a manner similar to the original Henry Ford, he was solely focused on developing the Ford mark itself, while subsidiary marks such as Lincoln, Mercury, Continental and Edsel were seen as superfluous, and thus he considered the creation of the Edsel division, as well as the individual Continental, Lincoln and Mercury divisions, a poor decision, and instead suggested that the marks be consolidated into a single division called MEL, or Mercury Edsel Lincoln. It was in this capacity that he proved to be the voice of reason behind the scenes to Ford's rather rash creation of new marks like the Edsel and Continental, eventually spelling doom for both of them, though in the meantime, Edsel's first range of models underwent development, with styling for the car based entirely on the market research gathered and seemingly incorporating many different features from a variety of other popular cars. Initially, the Edsel mark consisted of 7 models: the Ranger 2-door sedan, the Pacer 4-door sedan, the Corsair 2-door and 4-door hardtop, the Citation 2-door drop-top, the Roundup 2-door station wagon, the Villager 4-door station wagon, and the high-end Bermuda 4-door station wagon, with each car following the same general styling cues of long sweeping curves, scallops in the profile, round 4 headlamp light clusters, and rear fins. However, the most controversial addition to the car was the fitting of a giant vertical oval grille, penned by assistant stylist Bob Jones, and done in response to the feedback from market research desiring the fitting of such an element. While the original concept drawings by Edsel chief designer Roy Brown were envisaged as very slender, with an almost delicate opening in the center, the choice of such a gaping hole in the front of the car was settled on due to engineering reasons, with the fear being that cooling problems for the engine would arise from having such a small intake. Final input on the design was made by Breach, who demanded that it be both taller and wider, so that it was a major part of the car's face and image, the model, without the grille, looking somewhat comparable to contemporary Oldsmobiles and Buicks, but with the grille took on a unique and distinctive stance, one the designers would later regret. Another odd choice was the arrow-shaped tail lights for the station wagon models, as in order to give the cars a unique rear styling, they were fitted with sheet metal lights that pointed inwards, but gave the impression to the drivers behind that, when the indicators were running, the arrows were pointing in the intended direction of travel, the right indicator pointing to the left, and the left indicator pointing to the right. Despite later complaints about these lights causing driver confusion, the management insisted that no sheet metal could be changed, while internally, the car once again attempted to meet the demands of market research by providing extremely complicated driver features. As standard, the car was fitted with interior styling cues like a rolling dome speedometer, warning lights for such conditions as low oil level, parking brake engaged, and engine overheating, ergonomically designed controls for the driver, self-adjusting brakes, seat belts, which were optional extras on other models, and child-proof rear door locks that could only be unlocked with a key. Most notable of all was the Teletouch push-button automatic transmission selector, a system pioneered on the Edsel after years of research and development, and had been conceived by Ford early in the 1950s, this being based on earlier developments in solenoid-driven transmission shift devices for a standard sliding gear gearbox. This electromechanical push-button transmission system placed the transmission buttons in a ring within the center of the steering wheel, providing more space on the dashboard and removing the need for a gear handle on the center console, and while the low-end Ranger, Pacer and station wagon models maintained a traditional automatic transmission, high-end Corsair and Citation models came with the Teletouch as standard. For power, the MEL division of Ford chose to create a brand new power plant for the Edsel model, that being the MEL V8, which replaced the older Lincoln Y-block power plant of 1952, with the high-end Citation and Corsair presenting a 6.7-litre Edsel E475 V8 engine, while the lower-range models comprised a motley selection of Ford inline-6 and V8 engines, with displacements ranging between 3.7 and 5.9 litres. In terms of performance, the Edsel models were generally comparable to its rivals, with the Citation presenting a 0-60 time of 7.4 seconds, a top speed of 123 miles an hour, and an average fuel consumption of 11.8 miles per gallon, while by contrast, the Buick Series 70 Roadmaster Riviera presented a 0-60 time of 9.9 seconds, a top speed of 119 miles an hour, and an average fuel consumption of 12 miles per gallon. As a startup marque, Edsel had no dedicated assembly plants, with all models sharing the production line with contemporary Ford and Mercury models, with every Edsel being tested, measured and assigned a quality score as it came off the line, the daily shipment of cars to dealerships being directed by the average quality score of every car built that day. Despite all the background problems regarding the Edsel's development, September 4, 1957 was declared E-Day by Ford, who went all out in promoting the launch of their new model range, the Edsel models entering sales at prices on par with Mercury's at the time, with the low-end Ranger starting at $2,484, the Pacer at $2,700, the Corsair at $3,311, and the Citation topping the range at $3,500, while with options, the Citation reached a price of $3,766. On October 13th, a top-rated television special called The Edsel Show was broadcast, an hour-long program starring Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, Rosemary Clooney, Louis Armstrong, Lindsay Crosby, the Four Preps and Bob Hope, the sole purpose of this TV special being to raise awareness of the brand name, and was presented as a musical variety show that garnered favourable reviews from contemporary critics, even winning the Look magazine TV award for Best Musical Show, as well as being nominated for an Emmy as the Best Single Programme of the Year. However, despite E-Day bringing approximately 3 million people to Ford showrooms across America and Canada, very few people actually went home with an Edsel for a variety of factors, the first revolving around the very name of the brand, as the Edsel mark, the paying customer, had no meaning unless they possessed some prior knowledge of the inner management structure of the Ford company. Among a sea of marques that usually adopted either the name of their company founder, such as Rolls-Royce, Ford and Buick, or were based on historical figures such as Lincoln, Mercury and Cadillac, Edsel stood out as something very obscure and unidentifiable. Next was the pricing, which failed to justify the brand's existence overall in comparison to other models in the Mel lineup, as while the concept of the Edsel was to fit into a price bracket between low-cost Ford models and premium Mercurys, it instead was priced almost identically to its kin, with the 1957 Edsel Ranger, for instance, costing almost exactly the same as the Ford Fairlane 500 and the Mercury Medalist, while the Pacer cost nearly as much as the Mercury Monterey, and the Citation cost nearly the same as the Mercury Montclair. The only instance of an Edsel coming in as a less costly option than a Mercury was between the Citation and the Park Lane, but this couldn't cover for the fact that the lower-end Edsel models were still being priced almost exactly alongside Mercury models, and thus could not cover the segment of the market as per Oldsmobile and General Motors. To further add to the Edsel's woes was its timing, as Europe, Canada and the United States were struck by an economic recession that began towards the end of 1957, known as the Eisenhower Recession, this being caused by a general slowdown in economic activity and pressure on businesses for supply to meet demand, the excessive mass production of the post-war boom having essentially caused the economy to trip over itself, starting a year-long economic slump. As such, sales for many of America's luxury and high-end motors faced a significant decline, with overall car sales falling 31% by the end of 1957, which, as exacerbated by the Edsel's poor pricing strategy, which put it in league with Mercury rather than bridging the gap between it and lower-end Fords, meant the marque suffered an equal drop in its prospective sales, failing to meet forecasts. Even without the Eisenhower recession, though, the Edsel, as a medium-priced car range, was entering into a shrinking market as marques and companies were consolidated, with market trends moving away from medium-range models, while a new breed of compact cars, such as the Rambler American by AMC, and economy cars like the Volkswagen Beetle, emerged to undercut larger models. In essence, smaller models sold by Ford were being moved up into the medium car bracket as compacts burrowed in beneath them on the market, and thus builders who specialized in creating medium-range models, such as Studebaker, faced demise, with a far more reasonable choice being for the Edsel marque to instead propose a series of compact and economy cars beneath the Ford brand to compete directly with the likes of the Rambler American and the Beetle. Regardless of what the market research was indicating, Rich considered that the segment for medium-range cars was not shrinking, and that the Edsel brand would succeed in a category he considered to still be strong, thus continuing to push the marque forward in its market bracket against all advice. Problems weren't just in the pricing and timing of the car, but also in the build, as while much of the Edsel's mechanics were based on contemporary Ford models of the era, there were still a number of differences that line workers struggled to adapt to. On the mass-production Ford and Mercury lines, workers were conditioned to assemble models of the same type over and over again, which they did with a certain degree of success, but throwing an Edsel model in at every 8th to 10th car meant that workers assembling these machines had to build the cars in a different manner, which also had to be done in a timely fashion so as not to reduce the plant output. The outcome was many aspects of Edsel cars being put together either hastily or incorrectly, resulting in reliability problems for the customer, though not every car that left the factory with problems was caused by an inexperienced workforce, with some workers deliberately singling out the Edsel models for sabotage due to the fact that they shared the name of the former company president. The American Labor Union, United Automobile Workers or UAW, had poor memories of Edsel Ford due to his constant locking of horns with them, and thus chose to deliberately build the cars that bore his name in an improper manner simply to spite his memory. This wasn't helped by Edsel's average reliability scoring for daily batches of cars, with the average score being based on the number of cars that left the factory without significant faults, though this was an arbitrary figure that meant that, if the average score was just over the acceptable minimum, then a significant number of cars would still be shipped to the showroom with reliability problems. While the problem cars should have had their faults rectified at the factory, Ford chose instead to push the problem downstream, and even on cars that were evidently poorly built, including loose body panels and broken mechanics, they passed on notes to the showroom explaining how to finish off the barely assembled units, with loose pieces of trim or poorly fitted parts being placed in the trunk of the car for the showroom mechanics to fix when they were delivered. Aside from poor reliability, the cars also presented a number of design flaws which made them unpopular among both customers and mechanics alike, with the Teletouch push-button automatic transmission being a highly complex piece of equipment that was seen by drivers as a problematic gimmick that replaced the horn button on the steering wheel hub, thus meaning when drivers attempted to blow the horn, they'd accidentally change gears instead. Furthermore, the control wires for the Teletouch system were routed too close to the exhaust manifold, which often caused unpredictable movement of the selector mechanism and, in some cases, complete failure, this being compounded by the fact that the electrical design required drivers to shift from park to reverse to neutral to drive in that order to avoid overloading the Teletouch motor. This motor was also not powerful enough to bring the car out of park while on a hill, so dealerships would instruct drivers to set the parking brake before pushing the park button, while issues were also encountered with the design of the new E475 engine, as the cylinder heads were set at an angle, with roof pistons forming both a squish zone on one side and a combustion chamber on the other. Combustion thus took place entirely within the cylinder bore, and mechanics were unable to confidently repair the engine due to a lack of distinct combustion chambers, the outcome of these many problems seeing a staggering 16% of Edsel owners report poor workmanship, which included both mechanical and build quality concerns with the car, while even the test cars presented to motoring critics had faults, with units used by popular mechanics illustrating a badly leaking trunk during rain and the odometers showing fewer than actual miles travelled. The most jarring issue with the Edsel, however, was its ever-present horse-collar grille, this vertical, elongated oval intake yoked to the front being a point of derision from the moment the car was unveiled, and by far the car's most notable trait, giving rise to a cavalcade of jokes and jeers, being compared unfavourably to the aforementioned horse collar, but also to a toilet seat, the face one pulls when sucking lemons, and, most vulgarly, a woman's privates. With such easily identifiable and profoundly ugly styling, no one wanted to be seen driving these cars, which served to tip the iceberg of Edsel's many other design, build and image problems, with one famous instance taking place when the then Vice President Richard Nixon was on a state visit to Lima, Peru, when crowds of people threw eggs at him and the Edsel Corsair he was riding in, to which he famously stated that they were throwing eggs at the car. Surprisingly though, despite the Edsel mark coming in below its expected sales forecast, the car represented the second largest launch for any new American car brand to date, selling 63,110 cars in the USA and 4,935 in Canada during its first year of production. This number only exceeded by the launch of the DeSoto brand under Chrysler in 1929, where 81,000 units were sold during the marque's first year. Regardless, in the face of the Edsel's seemingly calamitous sales entry, Ford, having convinced themselves that their marketing campaigns, including E-Day and the Edsel TV special, hadn't reached a wide enough audience, despite the fact that customer feedback was proving otherwise, decided to pull out all the stops to get the car promoted. While there were a conventional slew of billboards and TV commercials, public relations executive Walter Tommy Thomas decided to take it a step further by offering customers a pony with their car. This outlandish idea somehow passing muster, and in association with the primetime TV show Wagon Train, customers who agreed to test drive an Edsel would have their name entered into a lottery at the dealership, and the lucky winner would receive a live pony as a pet. To support this very strange promotional campaign, Ford purchased 1,000 Appaloosa ponies and had them shipped to Edsel dealers across America, which created a severe rift between the dealers and the Ford management, as not only were they burdened with finishing the assembly of the cars they received, as well as dealing with the numerous customer complaints regarding reliability, but now they had to buy food and clean up after live ponies that were kept on site. While at the encouragement of their children, many parents did test drive an Edsel, the winners of the lottery chose instead to take the alternative cash prize of $200, with the failure of the campaign, together with the discontent it spawned between the management and the dealers, meaning it was soon curtailed, and the animals were shipped back to Detroit. Following this, Ford finally realized that the problem wasn't promotion, but the car itself, and chose to undertake a downsizing of the range to try and recoup its substantial losses, with the 1959 model year seeing only the lower-end Ranger and the high-end Corsair put on sale, these two cars being based on the underpinnings of other Ford models, while those cars based on Mercury products were discontinued. As the top-of-the-range replacement for the Pacer, the Corsair was now offered as a 2-door and 4-door hardtop, 2-door and 4-door sedan, and the Villager station wagon, and mechanically, the car abandoned the troublesome Teletouch system in favor of a more conventional Milomatic 2-speed automatic transmission and a dual-power drive 3-speed automatic transmission. The Mel V8 was also removed from the Edsel engine, with only the 5.4-litre Ford FE V8 being offered in the Corsair, while the Ranger was provided with both inline-6 and V8 power plants depending on trim, a more notable change being the toning down of the styling, which saw the vertical grille, though still present, be now presented with a fine bar pattern to cover up the gawking intake, and looked largely comparable to contemporary Pontiacs. In essence, the Ranger and Corsair looked externally the same, and could only be distinguished through trim options, but due to the models being stylistically similar to the latest Ford Fairlane, the question of why the Edsel brand needed to exist remained a hot topic among customers and management figures, especially Robert McNamara, who had recently brought about the end of the Continental mark after only 1 full year of use. By the middle of 1959, McNamara had succeeded in vetoing the marque's excessive advertising budget, and now, with money pouring from the division, he convinced Henry Ford II and the company management that the marque had no future, recommending that the loss-making Edsel division be axed before it bled the company dry. Therefore, Ford announced on November 19, 1959, that the Edsel division would be discontinued, although production of cars would continue until the end of the month, values for Edsel products following this announcement dropping by as much as $400, and dealers scrambled to renegotiate newspaper advertising contracts involving the 1960 Edsel models, while others dropped the name from their advertising entirely. The press release by Ford was followed by the distribution of coupons by the company to customers who had purchased the 1960 model Edsel cars, which were valued at $300 to $400 towards the purchase of new Ford products to offset the decreased value of the Edsel models, while the company also issued credits to dealers for stock unsold or received following the announcement. In the end, only 116,000 Edsel cars were sold, which represented less than half the company's projected break-even for the project. Though more worrying was the fact that 118,287 cars had been produced overall, 7,440 of which being from Ford's factory in Ontario, Canada, meaning that, by the end of the project, 2,287 units were left unsold, Ford having lost $350 million on the venture, which equates to approximately $3 billion in 2025. Following the end of the Edsel, questions echoed across the American motor industry as to what's caused its downfall, with Robert McNamara and his harsh policies towards Ford's subsidiary brands being vilified, though the reality was that he saw the car for what it was, a poorly designed and poorly built failure, with there being no single reason as to the collapse of the Edsel, as it was simply a perfect storm of timing, design, build quality, marketing and management. While the concept did have its merits when conceived in 1955, By the time the car was launched in 1957, the American auto market had changed substantially, and this, coupled with the car's widely maligned styling and attempts at innovation that came across as gimmicks, only fueled its demise.